This video I'll show you how to take an uninked chunk like this Nebularis badonkachonks and ink it using my absolutely phenomenal black gold textured inking technique. There's 4 main layers to this ink effect. First, a matte black base with some texturing. Second, a dark bronze wash. Third, a bright bronze dry brush. And then fourth, a final black wash. For the matte black base, I'm using a Liquitex acrylic gouache, which is not just beautifully matte, but it's also a bit thick and rubbery. That helps add depth to the texture itself, for which I'll use a folk art Terra Cotta in their black obsidian, as well as a deco art texture sand medium, which adds a lot of grit to this effect. I'll post links to everything in the video's description. Add a generous amount of the black acrylic gouache, then about an equal amount of the Terra Cotta texture. For the texture sand, this will depend a lot on how many loose particles of textures you want in your effect. Usually, a lot of the texture sand makes it feel more like an earthy type of texture. A little bit less of it makes it feel more like a metal type of texture. Mix in a few drops of water. I find these pipettes are super helpful. Water should be just fine, but if you also want to go extra fancy on this, I add in a couple drops of flow aid. Flow aid basically makes your mixture here more fluid without actually watering it down. And then technically you shouldn't mix your paint like this with your brush, but f it. Just make sure to quickly rinse it so you don't get any dried paint in the ferrule. This is a number 3 size paintbrush with a round style head, which I think works great overall for dice. The size fits my badonkachonks and my jumboys, but might be a little bit too large for smaller dice, so look for something smaller. Make sure you've mixed thoroughly and then rinse off all the excess paint. Painting should be pretty straightforward. Don't skimp on the paint and apply coats evenly. I think the only tip I've got here is to make sure you're getting all the side walls of the number well. Usually when you're looking at it down one angle, you realize later on that you weren't actually painting the walls that you weren't able to see. So just make sure you go all around and turn the die in all different angles. You can see the texture now, but this will still look fresh and glossy until it dries. Then just probably put on some music or TV and get going with all the numbers. Just one final inspection to make sure we got everything, and then we'll get this resting to dry out for about maybe 5 to 10 minutes. Once it's dry, you'll see that this already looks phenomenal. You can either leave it as is and it'll just be this textured matte finish. You could also dry brush it with some grays or metallics to give it a sort of stone effect. The other thing you can do, and what we'll do here, is give it a second coat. So this will add a little bit of lumpiness and unevenness to the texture. So you'll notice here that we've got like texture on texture. So just let it dry as before, and then we'll go on to the next step. So once dry, this is looking amazing. So let's just go ahead and do our next step. The next step here is to do a wash. You can use Games Workshop, Army Painter, or Vallejo washes, or you could also just make your own. I'll do a separate video with a deep dive on washes, but this one is about 10 millimeters matte medium, 10 millimeters distilled water, 1 millimeter flow aid, and 1 to 3 millimeters of black acrylic ink. So that's about 20 to 60 drops. I use golden iridescent because they're very heavily pigmented, but they're kind of heavy. So on a wash, they'll spread out and settle on the surface when you apply. Then lastly, I'll have the flow aid handy in case I need to make any tweaks as we go. This Liquitex one works pretty well and it's not as expensive. If you're familiar with miniature painting, washes are very fluid and with low surface tension. So they spread out and settle on crevices or corners. They're therefore usually black or dark and are used to add shadows. Then we'll tint the wash slightly with some bronze paint, which is basically like a dirty gold. The only drawback is as you're applying it, you need to mix it just before you pick it up back with your brush. Wash can be applied selectively into crevices, corners, or just covering the entire surface to sort of dirty it up a little bit. In this case, we'll do the full surface since we're tinting our base with this bronze. The wash should quickly spread out and it shouldn't tint the high spots of the texture. If it is, then add a little bit more fluid aid or mix another wash with less bronze pigment. Go through all the numbers, but don't overdo it because the wash is going to drip and not settle evenly. Once you're done, make sure you hit everything and with the right amount. Otherwise, just go back and add it back in. Let this dry for about 15 to 20 minutes. Once dried, of course, this looks phenomenal. You can stop here, or if you are incredibly extra like I am, I add a bit of more contrast to this effect by accentuating the highlights and then deepening the shadows. The highlights, I'll use this Folk Art brushed metal bronze. Because this is brushed on directly, if you go with a very bright metallic like the golden iridescent, you'll get very bright highlights. So these paints are a little bit more toned down, which I think will fit great here. The way dry brushing works is you load up a bit of paint on a brush and then you wipe off most of it. What you're aiming for is just a little bit of paint buried inside the brush. So if you're trying to paint something, you really have to rub the brush onto something in order to get the paint part exposed. So the effect this achieves is that you only paint the raised parts of a texture. So this happens because the paint on the brush can't really reach the low points on the texture. When you're dry brushing, if you apply more pressure, you'll produce more highlights. If you apply less pressure, then less highlights. You can also make highlights much more pronounced by using a lighter paint, but here I want it to be a little bit more subtle. Make sure you've hit everything. You can do more passes on it if needed, or if you want to punch up the highlights a bit more. In this case, I'll give everything another go. You can see here how by doing and then repeating all of these layers, we're progressively concentrating the effect. Just go as far or as short as you want with all the steps. Okay, and now the final step will be to punch up, or I guess punch down, the shadows a bit more. I'll do this using wash again, but this time instead of washing the entire surface, which will likely darken the whole effect, I'll just target the walls and corners of the number wells. I'll add a little bit more flow aid to make sure that the wash flows into the corners nicely. Remember, like before, to make sure that you hit all the walls. That's it. The only thing left is to clean up. Use a cotton ball with some alcohol in it. Make sure you wring out most of the alcohol, since getting some into the number wells can mess with the effect. I tend to not press too hard when wiping. Instead, I'll just do a quick wipe on all faces and let the alcohol break down the paint. Then I'll go back and do another wipe with a new cotton ball to properly clean everything up. And then I give this thing a final cleanup with a microfiber cloth. And you're done. One magnificently inked and beautiful looking badonkachonk.